This virtual session today is going to be completely optional, right? So if it doesn't seem to be super useful to you, feel free to leave. I'm basically going to be going through modules 5 and 6 and reviewing main ideas and vocab from those modules. And because I don't want this virtual session to be 5 hours long, I'm not going over every single detail. I also will give you some hints about how to help yourself on module 7, the human body module, if you're having issues understanding that content, although I find that that one is a lot easier to understand than some of the other modules have been. So some of the stuff we have talked about before, we're going to review it. I am going to post the PowerPoint that I made, and also I might add some human body stuff to it if you want to look at it. So basically, let's see. There we go. All right, so we're just going to review through the modules. It's been a while, especially since we talked about evolution. And I know the second module of this semester, module 6, was challenging for some people because it just had tons of new vocabulary and lots of details. All the different kinds of plants, the protists, the fungi, etc. Obviously, you don't need to memorize all that stuff, but it can be overwhelming. So we're just going to review key concepts and vocabulary from each module, and then I'm going to take questions. Awesome, thanks, Devin. I'm going to take questions as we go. So if you have a question, just type it in the chat, or feel free to speak if you want to talk and ask your question instead. Even if it doesn't relate to what I'm talking about, it's fine. Just if you have a question about something, feel free to interrupt, and I will either answer it or come back to it. So the first module from this semester was evolution. And in this module, really, there's not too much detail, thankfully, because it could have gone really detailed. My biggest issue with it was that most of the heavy content was in the first lesson. And I know a lot of people kind of skimmed through that one and didn't really focus. So the main theme of this module is that all organisms have changed over time. And there's really only 2 major vocabulary words that you need to know. Evolution itself, right? And then natural selection, which is the mechanism by which evolution happens. So evolution is the concept that all organisms come from common ancestors and are related. And then the mechanism by which this happens is natural selection. So there's kind of 2 parts to it, right? All organisms are related and have common ancestors, and there's a process that evolution happens. The process is called natural selection, which is kind of hard to put into a short definition. The shortest definition would be the process by which evolution happens, right? But that doesn't really tell us much. So I wrote this: traits that are better suited for the environment will help an organism survive and reproduce and pass on those traits. This can cause population change over time, right? So natural selection is all about surviving and reproducing, which is why I have those words in caps here. You could have the best traits in the world, but if you die, it doesn't matter. You need to survive and reproduce to pass on the traits to offspring, right? So natural selection is usually a pretty slow process. The only populations that we've been able to observe it in are bacteria, because bacteria reproduce really quickly. So we can introduce a change into a bacterial population. We could grow bacteria for a few months, and we would be able to see natural selection happening, where that trait would actually become pretty prominent in the population and would be something that we could observe being passed on to other bacteria. So there are 5 pieces of evidence for evolution that they gave in the first lesson. I included a link here that you guys will be able to access once I post the PowerPoint. That just goes to this article that I used to have my students read in my traditional classroom. It gives you just a little bit more detail, and it gives a lot of really good examples, right? So they give biogeography, there's like tons of stuff, the fossil record, they have a lot of pictures and a lot of examples. So if the evidence for evolution is something that you're kind of feeling like, I don't know if I really understood all that stuff, right? You might want to go check this out and see if reading about some of these things could help you, and hearing just more examples always helps. So I summarized evolution and all of the evidences for it. I believe I showed this in a previous virtual session, so we're going to go really quickly through it, but I just wanted it to be in this review place, right? So evolution is a slow change of organisms over time. There's no goal. It did not set out to create humans. It's a response to changes in the environment, and it's controlled by natural selection. This may seem familiar to people. Paleontology, or fossil evidence, right? Basically, this tells us how old organisms are, how long ago they lived, what kind of environment they lived in, and what other kinds of organisms they lived near. That can give us a lot of insight into common ancestors, right? So fossils are the remains of once living organisms. Most fossils we find belong to species that are no longer living on Earth, right? Most species are extinct that have existed. And the kinds of fossils found in rocks can show us different ages, right? Again, this can point us to common ancestors, especially if we see over time organisms losing a leg, like whales, right? Or organisms developing an eye over time. Those kinds of things have been seen in the fossil record. We also have the biogeographical evidence, right, which was actually the first evidence that Darwin personally saw about evolution, right? He was really into observing nature. And so he went to the Galapagos Islands and he noticed all these finches, right? On the mainland of South America, finches eat seeds. That's it. They don't really have variety in beaks or food type. They eat seeds, and they're all pretty similar in that way. On these islands, he saw all these different types of beaks that were more adapted for eating fruit, leaves, insects. He even saw finches using tools, which is crazy, picking up sticks and like digging in the earth, and then grubs or worms, right? So all these beaks, they look really similar, but they're slightly different, right? You can see more curve, more point, etc. So what Darwin hypothesized is that originally this seed-eating finch flew to the islands, or when the islands moved, was there. And because of the different food types available, some offspring, right, are going to be born with a slightly different beak. Just like maybe your nose looks slightly different than your parents', for example, right? Or maybe it looks the same. Sometimes you have a slight difference. So if a finch was born that was able to eat fruit really easily because it has a curved beak, well, that finch was going to survive and reproduce like crazy because there's a ton of fruit to eat, right? There's a lot of seeds too, but the fact that this one finch could eat something different, didn't have to compete with any other finches, it's going to survive and reproduce, right? And finches are impressed by your ability to obtain food when they're looking for a mate. That's pretty much all they care about. Are you healthy and eating? Okay, that's what they care about, right? So if a finch is eating tons of fruit, it's going to be getting tons of mates. And then eventually, there will be an entire population of finches that eat fruit, right? And so this happened many different times with different types of food. And now when you go to these islands, you see all of these different finches. So organisms on islands can evolve separately from organisms on a main land, and organisms can come from a common ancestor, but migration to another part of the world can change their evolution, right? Because it's all about the environment. So if we take a seed-eating finch and we put it in a location where there's no seeds, it's not going to do well. It's going to die. And then that would probably be the end of the seed-eating finch in that part of the world, right? So the environment does play a role here. The finch needs to have a trait that works in that environment, or any animal or plant, right? We also talked about developmental biology. I know when we watched that whale video, right? This is probably coming back to some people. Embryos look the same in the early stages of development between a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a chicken, a cow, and a human, right? They look almost identical. For example, you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference between a human and a calf in this early stage of development. As they develop more, right, obviously towards the end, we start seeing like human characteristics versus obviously chicken and calf characteristics. The turtle will get a shell. The salamander gets like wing things. And then the fish obviously looks like a fish. So later in development, they do diverge, but all organisms all organisms look really similar in the early stages of development, which is another piece of evidence to suggest that common ancestors exist, right? In fact, there was this really interesting but messed up theory during this time when evolution was kind of still being discussed as a possibility. There was this guy, I forgot what his name was. He's kind of a jerk, but his theory, get ready for this, was that time in the womb or development time is what determined what kind of organism you were going to be. So his theory was that fish just didn't stay in the womb as long as a human. And so that's why humans were more complicated, right? And he even took it further and broke it down by race and by gender, right? That white males were developed in the womb the longest, which is why they were the superior organism. Obviously, that theory did not last long. But that was, scientists were thinking that based on this embryo concept here, that maybe there was something to the gestation period. Obviously, we know that's not true, right? Elephants gestate much longer than humans. And I think most people would argue that humans are more complex than elephants, but maybe not, right? So there were lots of interesting theories using the same evidence that were occurring. So organisms look similar during early embryo stages, right? Especially if they're animals, they have certain characteristics present, which we also have already talked about, and I will bring up again in a second. Again, this is the chordate features. So we're looking at all things from the phylum Chordata, which we're going to talk about in a moment, what phylums are. So we also have comparative anatomy, right, which is literally comparing anatomy, looking at bones, looking at tissues, right, looking at the similarities, especially in the ratio here of bones, 1 bone, 2 bone, many bones, 5 finger type bones. The whale obviously only has 4, but still there's a lot of similarities here between what these arms look like. And we have not found out exactly what the gene mutation would be, but scientists believe that it's possible that a slight gene mutation could give those different mutations, right? So the bat is probably just 1 or 2 genes off from a human, and that produces these skinnier bones in the same proportion. Okay, genetic evidence. Right, this is really what solidified evolutionary theory. Before we knew about DNA, before we knew about genes, a lot of this evidence, people were kind of like, maybe it means that, we don't know. Then DNA comes into the picture, right, in the 1950s, and scientists start really looking at it and figuring out how to compare organisms. And they're like, oh, okay, wow, DNA is really similar between a lot of organisms, right? Humans have 95% of their DNA in common with a rabbit. That was a shock to many scientists, right? Because they're like, wait, there's only a 5% difference, yet look at how we look versus how a rabbit looks. Look at how we act versus how a rabbit acts, right? Even yeast, which honestly, what does yeast do? It just sits there and basically metabolizes, and that's it. We have 45% of our DNA in common with yeast. Right, so this DNA evidence really made scientists, support this idea of a common ancestor. There must be a common ancestor, because why else would the DNA be the same? Okay, that was module 5. I'll pause here. Actually, I'm going to grab more coffee really quick. You guys know how I am about coffee. If you have a question about module 5, or you have a question about something that we did in module 5, like one of the labs, take a second now. You might even want to open your grades, look at your grades, see if you have a question, because I'm here to answer it, and I'm going to grab more coffee. Okay, I'm back. The cladograms are hard. I agree. So we're actually going to talk about them again right now. So module 6, I think, was the hardest module from this semester, right? The main idea of this module is that living things are organized into 6 kingdoms of life due to their similarities in reproduction, nutrition, growth, development, etc., right? Their DNA, basically everything. There's a lot of vocab from this. In fact, I'm going to show you guys something that I don't know if everyone knows about. Oops, how do I get out of this? Okay. So in any of the lessons in biology course, you can click on this glossary. This is going to bring up every single vocab word that's used in the entire course of biology, including biology A, right? Some of these things we probably maybe don't need a definition for example, addiction, right? Most of us probably know what that means. And some of these words are rarely, like, they're used in one lesson. Adhesion, right? A lot of that stuff was from the first semester. But regardless, this is something that you could easily print out and highlight the words as you see them in the lesson or as you're reviewing. So for example, maybe you want to look for, let's see if cladogram is in here. Watch it not even be in here. I'll be really sad. I'm in the wrong alphabet part here. Clone. I don't see cladogram. Well, that's sad. But regardless, most of the words apparently are in here, right? So this is a good thing to use to review. And obviously, you don't need to review the words from first semester, right? Although they are good to know. But it's definitely useful, I think, to have this printed or have it open, because you can even do Command F or Control F. You could look for a word. And if it's there, it will tell you. And if it's not, it won't come up. So yeah, use that to help you with vocab. Now, I picked some of the really key words, especially words that are used in the DBA, and things that I thought people were having a hard time kind of understanding. So a cladogram, right, which was honestly the hardest part of this, is it's basically a branching tree that shows the evolutionary relationships. So the way you want to think about it is, what could have happened, what changes could have happened over time to these 3 or 4 or 40 organisms. So for example, if we have 4 organisms, I'm going to try to draw on this thing. Let's see how it works for me. So we're going to make a cladogram. Let's say we have a fish, a bird, and a frog. And we want to figure out how to organize these things on a cladogram. Well, if we think about it, right, birds and frogs both have legs, right? Fish don't. Okay, so fish are kind of separate in that they don't have legs. Birds have feathers, right? Do fish or frogs have feathers? No. Frogs have kind of similar skin to fish, right? So if I were to make a cladogram of this, I would say that our first branch is going to be a fish. And we could do any kind of class, like way to divide that because really it's like the first thing. Next, I would say would come frog. Kendrick. All right, next would come frog. And the reason I would say this is, well, depending on the fish, right? But frogs can breathe on land as well. So what is sort of separating a fish from a frog? You could pick from a lot of things, right? There's a lot of stuff separating fish from frogs. Personally, I'm going to say development of lungs, because frogs are able to breathe on land, which is a big deal. Okay. Then, and because they all have bones, they're all chordata. Yeah, actually, that's really true. We could even, get out of here, little text box. We could even say that actually as the base of our cladogram here. We could say chordata, right, which is a phylum here, which really means they're all vertebrates, right? They all have bones. They all also have a bunch of other things, but we'll just say that. Yeah, so chordata, first thing we have is fish, right? Development of lungs, we have a frog. Then we could say, we could pick anything. That's what makes these cladograms hard, is that there's not technically a right answer necessarily. It's like a hypothesis. And not only that, but as long as your argument makes sense, you can organize it in a lot of different ways, right? Usually there's a better way to do it, but it's not necessarily wrong. So we could say that between the frog and the bird, we could say development of wings, right? We could say development of feathers. We could talk about the eyes, how the eyes of birds are on the side of the head. Right, so there's a lot of different things we could pick here. So I'm just going to say development of wings, especially since we already have development of lungs. And then that will give us a bird. Now, obviously, this is a super simple example. And real cladograms that they would ask you to do in a science like situation are going to have specific species, right? And the differences are going to not be as obvious necessarily. That's where this can get hard, is trying to figure out what is different between them that could have changed. So then we can go back and look at this and say, okay, chordata, they're all chordates, sure. Okay, we have fish. Then development of lungs. Well, fish don't have lungs, so that works. Frogs have lungs, okay. Development of wings. Okay, frogs and fish don't have wings, birds do. Right, so you can kind of go back and check. So really, if anything that I want you to get out of a cladogram from this class is really that if you see one, you understand what it is. It's showing an evolutionary relationship. How did these organisms change and evolve over time? So the biggest cladogram that we have really is like the tree of life, which I'm going to Google in 1 second. I didn't realize I had to erase each line by itself. Okay. Okay. So when we look at the tree of life, ooh, tree of life tattoo. It's not what we want. Let's see. We can see something like this is kind of a simplified version, but this will work. This is basically a complex cladogram, which is kind of tiny, but hopefully you guys can see it. At the bottom, they have protists, right? Then branching off to one branch here, we have all different types of plants. We have seaweed coming off separately from land plants, right? On another branch, we have worms, and then we have crustaceans, crabs, etc., and insects, right? On another branch, we go into vertebrates, and then we have all the vertebrates. And then in another branch, we have sponges and echinodermata and protozoans. So this is one example where they didn't even define why they're branching the way they are, but we could figure it out, right? We could look and say, okay, well, what are these, for example, like seaweed obviously is branching off because it's a water plant, right? Versus these land plants, which are on land. So sometimes it's a really simple reason, other times it's not. Basically, if you see something like this, I want you to be like, oh, that's showing the evolutionary relationships. So other things from this module, we had Linnaean taxonomy, right? This was the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. This is organizing them by their similarities, right? Specifically their characteristics. And now we use DNA to do this as well. All right, back in the old days of Linnaeus, obviously they didn't know about DNA, so they weren't using it. Another really big one, guys, that people have been struggling with, especially on the DBAs, is antibiotic resistance. Right, what does that mean? So first of all, it comes from a mutation in bacteria. Right, every time bacteria divide and reproduce, there is a chance that there's going to be a mutation. Right? Same with your cells. Now, there are things put in place, especially in your cells, that go back and check the DNA to make sure there's no problems. Obviously, they're not foolproof. Bacteria have the same thing, but again, it's not foolproof. Sometimes mutations happen, and they get missed, and they continue. So, unfortunately for us, bacteria, sometimes a mutation results in their ability to not be killed. Right? They essentially become immortal from antibiotics and from antibacterial, basically any kind of antibacteria, biotic stuff. So that's why, first of all, if you have antibacterial soap in your house, you need to throw it away because you are part of the problem. You're helping bacteria become resistant to soap, meaning that eventually soap's going to do nothing, right? Same thing with antibiotics. If they're overused or they're used when people don't have infections, a lot of times people are like, oh, I have a cold, I want antibiotics. They're not going to do anything for you, and you're helping bacteria become resistant, right? The more they get exposed to these things and the more that they breed, which is happening every second, the more likely they are to become resistant. So basically they have a mutation and they pass it on via mitosis to their offspring, right? And then those offspring pass it on. And then we get an entire sort of like breed of bacteria that can resist. So one example of this is in Peru. There's a disease called tuberculosis, right? You guys might have heard of it, TB. You might even have been tested for it. They do like this weird, they like prick your arm. And then if you have, they look at it later, and if you have some kind of bump, it tells them that you have TB, right? And then they also x-ray your lungs. It's basically like hardcore bronchitis. Your lungs are super, super congested. You have no appetite. And then pretty slowly over months and months, you just get sicker and sicker and sicker until you die. And this used to be a super, super deadly disease, right? It was common, it was everywhere. This is before antibiotics existed. A lot of people died from it. It was kind of glamorized by artists even. It was like kind of chic to be dying of TB and doing art. Regardless, we came out with antibiotics and then suddenly we could cure it. And now no one's dying from it, right? Except TB has now, some strains of it have become resistant to antibiotics. So now there's kinds of TB, and especially in Peru, there's this whole sort of little area that has people who have this antibiotic resistance TB, and they're sort of like, they're allowed to go out, you can't quarantine them necessarily for it. They're allowed to go out into the market and to work and to wherever, and they just cough and cough and cough, right? And, in theory, they could be spreading it to people. And I remember I saw this documentary about it, because you guys know I like to watch science documentaries. And this one woman couldn't even kiss her child because she didn't want to pass it on to him, which is really sad. And again, it's also a death sentence. You're going to die from it eventually. So it's pretty intense. Anyway, antibiotic resistance is an issue in our modern world, especially because we're not coming out with new antibiotics, right? Drug companies don't want to fund that. There's no money in antibiotics. It's a lot of money to research them, not a lot of profit. So they're not interested. No one's funding it. So other vocabulary from this module, this was 3 or 4 vocab words from the plants that I picked. These are adaptations that help plants live on land, right? So we have the cuticle, which is the waxy coating on a plant, which helps plants conserve water. You may have even seen that when you see some plants that look like fake plants because they're so shiny. They're not necessarily fake. They probably just have a cuticle, or they could be fake. We also have the stomata, which is the tiny pores on the bottom of the leaf that help the plant control gas exchange. So, for example, if the plant is not going through photosynthesis, it will close its stomata so that it doesn't lose oxygen, because it needs oxygen as well to do cellular respiration. Or if it's really working hard, it will open all the stomata so gases flood into the leaf and help create that sugar. Right? Then we also have vascular systems and woody tissue, which these things just help plants transfer water and food from roots to shoots. Think about a tree. Water comes in at the roots. The water has to make it all the way up to the top of a tree, right? Before plants could do that, they couldn't grow tall. How could they if they can't get water to their leaves? Water is needed to do photosynthesis, right? So if water can't get to the leaves, the plant can't make food, it's going to die. So the vascular system and woody tissue help plants do that, right? And it seems obvious, but that didn't exist before. They also go into all the 6 kingdoms of life here, which I've already talked about them briefly, but we will review them again. And we're going to really talk about the plants, the 4 types of plants, because that was kind of something that you guys spent quite a bit of time on. So we have eubacteria, right? The common bacteria. Some of them have a cell wall, some of them don't, right? Antibiotics specifically can target cell walls because we don't have cell walls in our cells. So some of them do that. If the bacteria doesn't have a cell wall, it will usually target specific proteins in the bacteria that we don't have. Bacteria contain a circular DNA strand, right? They have no membrane-bound organelles because they're prokaryotic cells, and they're single-celled. Again, I'm going through this quickly. I'm going to post this, so you're welcome to access it as many times as you need. We also have the archaebacteria, right? Really not much to say about them. They're found in extreme places. They're prokaryotic. They're single-celled. These are the bacteria found in volcanoes, right? These are the bacteria found in deep sea vents where nothing else is living. Plantae, or plants, right? They're eukaryotic. They're multicellular. They have a cell wall, chloroplasts, and huge vacuoles, right? They photosynthesize, et cetera, et cetera. I could have put a ton of things here. There's 4 types of them, of plants, right? And this kind of shows us evolution. If we were making a cladogram, our first plant would be a non-vascular plant. Doesn't have any vascular tissue, doesn't have leaves, doesn't have flowers, doesn't have seeds. It needs a moist environment, right? So these types of plants would be like moss, liverwort, hornwort, like little grassy, fuzzy plants. They can't grow very big, right? Because they can't transport water very far. And then obviously they don't have leaves, flowers, seeds, etc. Again, this is a super brief summary of that, right? Non-vascular plants have a ton of more information that you should probably review. Vascular plants, this is when we have the development of xylem and phloem, which I like to remember this as phloem sounds kind of like food because the phloem helps transport food and the xylem helps transport water. So these types of plants could get a little bigger, right? Because now they have these vascular tissues. So we end up really just seeing bigger mosses, essentially, that can actually grow up, right? We see more like stem development and the plants start to be able to grow bigger. Then we get seeds, right? The next branch of this cladogram would be a seed plant. Plants didn't have seeds before, right? Now they do. Seeds can travel via animals, dropping onto the ground, wind. Right now, plants don't need water to transport their eggs and sperm, right? They can actually drop a seed somewhere and a new plant will grow. And that means they can reproduce in dry settings. Right now you see a huge diversity of plants happening because they can grow in many different climates. Right? And seeds don't have to look necessarily like what we imagine them to. Dandelion seeds, for example, are those white flowers. Think about those. When you blow on those, all those little seeds break apart and float everywhere. Right? So all they need is a tiny bit of wind or a dog or something to walk by and the seeds get distributed. Maple tree seeds look kind of flowery like. And then we have burdock seeds, those like sticky burr things. So they can actually stick to you so that when you walk, you travel and bring them to somewhere else. Right? There's a whole bunch of other kinds of seeds, but those are like three kind of special ones. Then finally, we get flowering plants, the most advanced, the most complex, and arguably the most beautiful of plants. Right? Now pollination can happen. That encourages animals to transport seeds, really not seeds, but pollen to a new plant, right? This increases genetic diversity. And we also now have this new structure, the ovary in plants, which becomes the fruit, right? Which like a lot of times really what fruit is meant to do is you're meant to eat fruit and then you poop out the seeds. So obviously we don't poop outside usually. So we're not really doing that, but animals and birds who are eating seeds and fruit, if they're eating the seed, I guess they're eating it, but if they're eating fruit, they are passing the seeds in their waste, right? And that can be one way that plants transport. Pretty crazy. Kingdom Protista, right? This is like the weirdest kingdom. They're not plants, they're not animals, they're not fungi. Some of them are photosynthetic, like algae, meaning they can make their own food. Some aren't, right? This is where you see weird stuff like slime molds. You see a lot of parasites, lots of creepy stuff in the Protist kingdom. They are eukaryotic, right, which separates them from bacteria. They can be single-celled or multicellular. And really, this is kind of known as the catch-all kingdom. This was kind of the kingdom that scientists just put everything in that didn't fit in another kingdom. Fungi, right, are eukaryotic, they're multicellular, they're plant-like, but they're heterotrophic, which means they have to get their food. They can't make it, right? There's a lot of comparisons that you can make to plants. They don't move really, right? They have root systems, but the fact that they can't do photosynthesis really does make them their own separate kingdom. And of course, they're major decomposers, right? They are super important to help decompose and recycle nutrients back into the ecosystem. And then Kingdom Animalia, I really didn't write that much for this one because most of us are more familiar with this kingdom than others. But we do have eukaryotic cells, multicellular organisms, And of course, this kingdom ranges from sponges to humans, right? Sponges are the most simple form of animals. Module 7, human body. So I have not outlined and written anything out really for this unit yet, because a lot of you are still in it, and I want you to kind of try to do this on your own, right? The main idea here is that large organisms, multicellular organisms like humans, are organized into systems, right? Plants are also organized into systems. They look a little different. So really, what we want to think about too, actually, this is a good thing. I probably should have added this before. I just thought of it. The way that organisms are organized. So from smallest to largest, we end up getting cells, which make tissues, which make organs, which make body systems, which make organisms, right? So cells are organized into tissues, which means basically it's all the same kind of cell. So muscle tissue, for example, all muscle cells working together. Organs, right? Specialized tissues, the stomach, the pancreas, the heart. Body systems, the endocrine system, the circulatory system, a bunch of organs working together to do something. And then finally, that creates the organism, which I spelled wrong somehow. So that's an important thing really to think about as you go through these body systems. The main things you should pick out are, what is the function of the body system? How does the body system achieve that function, right? And that's going to actually start to force you to look at organs, to look at tissues in some cases, to see how that body system does its function. And of course, you want to be relating back to this word homeostasis, or maintaining an internal balance. So how does that body system help? For example, circulatory system, right? Blood and heart and veins and arteries. The function of that system is to bring oxygen to the tissues and remove waste from the tissues. So homeostasis is maintained because there's an exchange of gases, right? Oxygen is provided, carbon dioxide is taken and released from the body, keeping you at homeostasis. If you can do that for each body system, think about how it helps maintain homeostasis, you will be golden in this module. Okay, that was a lot of talking. So now we'll pause again. Any questions about any of that stuff? About any of the labs? About anything? Great question. Do we have to take the final at MIWA? No, you don't. And you can use your notes on the final, right? So feel free to use your notes. Feel free to have specific lessons open, maybe, if you would like to, right? That's fine. Make sure on any short answers, I don't think there are short answers on the final, but if there are, make sure you're using your own words, right? Because I do look very closely for plagiarism. I'm pretty good at finding it. So make sure you're using your own words, but otherwise, you can use notes, you can use the lessons, you can use the virtual sessions, right? You can use any of these resources. This class is more about critical thinking and about getting a general idea of what biology is. So where should you be in the class? Well, that's going to, like, what lesson should you be on? That's going to depend for basically when you started the class, but I can tell you kind of where most people are. Give me a second. I had to unshare my screen because then I'm going to blow someone's grades up right now. If you started the class in the beginning of the semester, January 31st, today you should be on nervous and endocrine systems, which I did a virtual session on. So you could always watch the virtual session, right? Which leaves you with, let's see, we have respiratory and circulatory systems after that. In fact, I can share, well, no, I don't want to share this. Muscular, skeletal, and integumentary system, which is bones, muscles, and skin. Reproductive system, immune system, and then you have the exam. So I would say the only complex body system is immune system. Oh, Devin says he's on musculoskeletal. Yeah. So it might be a few, like I said, everyone's due dates are different, which is kind of what's annoying about Canvas. So you might already be on respiratory, circulatory, or muscular, skeletal, integumentary, depending, right? Today is the 15th, so what I'm seeing is nervous and endocrine system is due for a lot of people today. Otherwise, yeah, we still have, let's see, we still have 1, 2, 3, 4, we still have 5 weeks left. And this is the last module. Yes, human body systems is the last module. We still have 5 weeks left. So you should have plenty of time, even if you're behind, to catch up. And remember, if you are super behind, maybe you're still in module 5, for example, you haven't started classification of living things, that's okay, right? Use the notes that I provided here. Try to even just get something done on the assignments, because some points is better than nothing, right? If you're somebody who can, you're welcome to go ahead and try to take the test and skip all the assignments. If you do well on the test, like you pass the test, meaning you get a 60 or higher, I will excuse you. Kirsten, I think I excuse you from all the collaboration projects. I will check. If you could send me an email about that, actually, that would be really great, because then I can remember later to check. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Well, remember, if you have a question, even if you didn't feel like asking it right now, or you think of one in 20 minutes, you can send me an email. On May 30th, right, which is in 2 weeks on Tuesday, there's going to be a open work session with me at MIWA from 12 to 2. So that would be a great time. That's about 2 weeks before the semester ends. So that's a great time to come in and get help on anything, any of the labs, right? You can even do the labs because I still have all the stuff. You have a question, you want to study, you want to work on the collaboration project, whatever, right? I'm going to be there for 2 hours. So please come by and get help, or even just hang out. And otherwise, we don't have any more labs or virtual sessions, right? So now it's really just about finishing the course and getting everything turned in. Okay. Well, thank you guys for attending. Hopefully this was helpful, got you remembering some of the stuff from previous modules. Good luck. And again, remember, you can use your notes on the final, right? Totally fine. There will not be any retakes on the final. So you only get one chance. So make sure you're ready when you open it and you take it. All right. Have a good week, everyone.